Thank you so much for joining us this morning or this afternoon, wherever you're tuning in from. I'm very excited for this panel. We'll be covering influencer marketing trends, the synthetic influencer, and also from various perspectives, from the perspective of the influencer, from the perspective of the brands, and legally. How do you cross borders with influencers? How do you follow trends carefully? So this will be a pretty broad discussion when it comes to the various elements of influencer marketing. I will be your moderator. My name is Cynthia Johnson. And today, instead of introducing each one of our panelists, I will allow them to introduce themselves. We'll start with Hayley, and then Hayley, you can pass to Jess, and Jess, you can pass to Teddy, and then we'll just dive right in. So I'll start with you, Hayley.
Perfect. Thanks, Cynthia. Hi, everyone. I'm Hayley Brady, and I'm a partner at law firm Herbert Freehills, and I'm probably unsurprisingly, based on my accent, I am based in London. I work across the media and entertainment space and advise clients on various things, one of which is their marketing strategies and from a legal perspective, what they can and can't do. And that also includes the wonderful world of influencers and using influencers to promote brands, etc. So I'll hand over to Jess.
Thanks, Hayley. Hi, everyone. My name is Jess Clifton. I am the head of branded marketing advisory at S4 Capital MediaMonks. And I have just joined this lovely firm as of January. Prior to that, I had a consultancy that they acquired. And I've spent my career working in a variety of advertising and marketing agencies. I was at Edelman Digital for 7 years, where I really built their influencer marketing practice into about a $50 million business. So I am intimately familiar with how to connect brands with influencers, and maybe too familiar with how to manage the legal aspects of that. Over to you, Teddy.
Hi, my name is Teddy Quinlivan. I am a model. I've been modeling for 10 years, and I'm also an LGBTQ rights activist. I happen to be transgender myself. And I have a podcast called Unholy and Curious, which is kind of like a cultural commentary, fashion, art podcast. So I have a lot of experience in the terms of the influencer world as kind of being an influencer myself, as a model and as a spokesperson for LGBTQ issues. But also I've, through this podcast, started to interview other influencers as well. So that's kind of like my experience in this territory.
Absolutely. And for those who haven't heard her podcast, we'll drop it into the chat later because it's phenomenal. I just started checking it out. So let's jump right in. I'm going to start with Hayley. Hayley, let's talk about the potential risks of hiring influencers cross-border. I know we discussed on our call going over this panel, so you have some stories where things maybe weren't as well thought out as they should have been and went wrong. And I'd love to hear you tell that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think what will come out probably in all of our conversation today is some of the things to be aware of and some of the things that maybe aren't as obvious at the outset. I think certainly one of the things that I've definitely seen is that the internet, social media is global, but regulation in this space and the way that different regulators look at the influencers varies massively from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And it's hard if you're a brand and you're looking to engage an influencer to know, okay, so how do I know in every different jurisdiction what the position is? And it's kind of not really workable to go and kind of find that out for every single jurisdiction, and no one does that. But I definitely think it is really important at the outset to understand when engaging a particular influencer what geographies they have a particular following in, and in those countries making sure that regulation is complied with. But also what I have seen is, where someone has a particular link to a country that's not immediately obvious. So to give an example, I worked with a brand who engaged 2 DJs. These were guys that were living in Ibiza at the time. Their posting would have all originated from Ibiza. They traveled, Berlin, London, the kind of more of the sort of club cities, but they happened to be from a small European country. And in the diligence, that country never got flagged because actually the followers on social media. It wasn't, you know, particularly high from that country, but actually it just so happened that the regulator there had a real issue with promoting this product and felt that it had jurisdiction because these guys are born there and they were known in that country. So I give that as an example, just as one area where I think it's not immediately obvious. And even if diligence is done, you definitely need to think about what different geographies might be relevant and be aware that regulators, you know, even across Europe, take a really different approach.
And maybe this is a question for Jess or Hayley, but who's responsible for that? Is it the brand? Is it the agency you're working for? Should the influencer know? Where do you think that the due diligence falls under understanding where, like, which jurisdictions you kind of fall under? Yeah, pass it.
I mean, I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
You want to get? I was going to say, look, I think all of them in a way, but I think if you're the brand, it's down. You know, you should be doing that. And I mean, Jess experience of that, but you know, I definitely think from a brand, if you look at where regulators, you know, when they take action, it's the brand. And you know, in the UK we see a lot of actual action taken against influencers as well, but the UK is particularly aggressive on this. So I don't think if you're the brand you can just rely on an agency, is my view.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think an agency has accountability to advising the brand and to ensuring that the influencers produce the correct disclosures on the content that they're developing. But ultimately, if the influencer doesn't abide by those disclosures, the brand will be accountable. And I've seen that go down with the FTC in the US dozens of times, despite the influencers actually being provided with the correct direction.
And when you talk about the disclosures and across what should be looking at the follower count? Is it where they're from? How are you deciding where the jurisdiction is and which rules to follow?
I mean, Hayley would be a better person to comment on this, but for us, you know, it's always typically country of origin or where they're making their content. So the majority of the influencers that I've worked with are largely based in the US. So we're always looking at kind of how we adhere to the FTC compliance guidelines. They're always changing, they're getting softer, they're getting harder. Like, you just have to be kind of in the know. But yeah, I think it's the country of origin and where they are specifically making the majority of their content. You can't necessarily, I mean, you can look at where their audience breaks down, and obviously like some US based influencers might have a significant following in EMEA. However, if they're based in the US, they're making content in the US, then ultimately they're beholden to following the US guidelines.
Understood.
Yeah, and I think if I was looking at someone that's making content in the UK, but they're very well known in the US, I think we would also look to not only comply with the UK ASA rules, but also the FTC in the US as well. So I think, yeah, I mean, the origin is definitely where you start, where there is particular countries that are of, you know, that person's very well known there.
And if, okay, so it's a big topic here, or the central piece of this panel is about synthetic influencers, which are essentially created influencers. They're algorithms, they're bots, they're not real, but they have a huge, massive following. Do they fall under the same rules, or is that would be considered more of a brand ownership? Or whoever owns that item, like a trademark or something?
Hayley, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. I think if you look at what the regulators' rules around marketing, that's all around protecting consumers and whether or not you're using a real or a synthetic influencer, that those consumer protection rules are still there. And actually things like using #ad is the same, right? Whether it's a real or a fake influencer. There are different issues to think about when we talk about trademarks and IP, because it's a different world when it's something that's been created than if it is, you know, a real life individual. So whilst my own view is the regulators, I think, are still trying to navigate this space, and you know, whether or not this becomes something that's very mainstream, we'll see. But I think the base rules around misleading consumers are still there and they still apply.
Yeah. And to touch on synthetic influences, but we'll start with Jess from the brand perspective, and then Teddy from the influencer perspective. Are you seeing a need or brands requesting or looking into creating synthetic influencers or working with them, or is it something that maybe hasn't really peaked yet as far as a trend?
Yeah, I mean, from the brand side, I don't think it's peaked yet, with the exception of some of the brands that have created their own synthetic influencers, and they're kind of testing, and they might be more on the side of innovation, right? So they're going to be the first to kind of play with this, and they're probably going to be the same brands that set the industry standard for how disclosures work and how compliance works and all of that. But overall, I think, you know, in my experience right now, brands are very interested in working with real, tangible influencers who have great stories, who have some dynamism, and who can, you know, create content based on the needs of their audience as well as the needs of the brand.
Right. And have great stories because they have a past, right? And I know I was actually really surprised, Teddy, by your take on synthetic influencers from the influencer perspective. Do you see them as somebody you would do a promotion with, a cross promotion, or even a competition at all, or not really?
Great question. I think that there's always going to be something more desirable in the human component when selling to other humans. I think that having that sort of having that humanity is what sells product. Having a face on a magazine is what sells a magazine. Having a known face selling a moisturizer is what ends up selling the moisturizer. There's something that is innately tangible when it comes to human advertising. I think that this new space of synthetic influencers, it's yet to take off, but I think that synthetic influencers have always kind of existed as brand mascots. So for example, like when we were talking prior, I used Mickey Mouse as an example, as like a brand mascot for Disney, which is, you know, an enormous brand. And when you see Mickey Mouse isn't a political person. He doesn't have any specific ideologies or leanings. There's no worry or concern that Mickey Mouse is going to say anything that you in the future on Twitter that might get him canceled. It's just a mascot that's been created by the brand that becomes synonymous with the brand itself. And I think that maybe we might see more of a rise of mascots for brands that have a more prominent, that take up more space in the digital world. But I think for now, there is sort of this weird hybrid going on where there are influencers who have created virtual personas, kind of like avatars. A great example of this is Little Michaela. Little Michaela is a very, very popular Instagram account, and it's run by a real person. It's a real girl who created this avatar, but it's not her, it's not the person who's running the account who's famous. It's actually the avatar itself that has become famous. There's also a Japanese one called Hatsune Miku, who is a kind of digital avatar that has garnered a lot of popularity. So at the end of the day, I think the most popular synthetic influencers, if they're not a brand mascot, they're sort of like a type of AI that at the end of the day has been run by a specific person. Or by like an entity telling it what to do, giving it instructions. So maybe in that way, it's a little bit more of a safer bet for brands. But at the same time, I don't think that as long as you're selling products to human beings, I think the human being component is going to be essential.
Yeah. I would build on that.
Please.
Actually, Teddy, you sparked something there for me. I actually think I can see synthetic influencers taking off more on behalf of real influencers, because it's a nasty world out there, right? And I think there's a lot of, it's hard to put yourself out on social and to have these big followings and hear some of the negativity that people just like to spout. And I obviously have less experience with this than, you know, somebody like Teddy would, but even the Little Michaela example kind of sparks in me that people want to put themselves out there, but they need to be like one step removed from that layer of negativity, because it does get so emotional and so draining for those people, that to kind of, if people are critical of your AI bot like object that has millions of followers, it's less of a blow than if people are critical of you as a person and a human being and how your body is shaped and so on. So I actually think that's a pretty profound point that you make, Teddy. And I think I would predict that synthetic influencers will probably increase on behalf of influencers more than even on behalf of brands. And as that happens, brands will get more comfortable because they know there's a person behind the AI, but the AI is a little bit more safe and structured, and they'll be able to do a little bit more creatively with that AI because it's not representative of that person directly.
I love that, because it starts with the person, it starts with the influencer, and it's the brands catching up to people and not the other way around, which is great, which is smart. When we're talking about, the negative comments and the things that can happen to you as an influencer, let's dive into a little bit to being canceled. What are some of the unintended consequences of either canceling an influencer or being canceled by a brand as an influencer? It's maybe from your personal experience or something that you've seen. What are some things to look out for if you do get that cancel notice or have to deliver one?
Teddy, you want to start and then I can pick up?
Yeah. I personally believe that cancel culture is sort of a thing of the moment. I think will be around forever, but I think that right now it's very sort of, it's a very kind of 2021, 2020 phenomena, because it's new. With the rise of the internet, there's also the rise of everybody being able to share their opinions. So now everybody has a platform. Everybody is sort of in their own way, their own spokesperson for what they find to be detestable, what they find to be admirable. So I think that there's always going to be the sharing of opinions regardless of what happens. But at the same time, I think that I think that human beings are coming around to the fact that we are actually all human beings and we all have the potential to be canceled for different various things. So I think that hopefully in the future, this is maybe me being like optimistic, but I think that cancel culture will reach a boiling point, to the point where so many people are being canceled and so many people are being called to be deplatformed, that it sort of like makes the cancel culture as a whole less important, less significant. Because I think one of the things that we're realizing through cancel culture is actually everybody has a past. Nobody is perfect. We're all human. And it's not like we emerged from the primordial goo enlightened. We have made, everybody makes mistakes. The severity of that mistakes and the consequences of that is really up to the public, because really a lot of the things that people get canceled for, they're not necessarily crimes. It's not criminal behavior. A lot of times it's just in the court of public opinion, and the court of public opinion changes based on the culture. So I think for me as an influencer, I always try my best just to not be offensive in the first place, because I obviously would like to, have as many opportunities as possible and just be a good person. And I don't want to live my life, walking around offending people. However, part of my identity as a human being is to have opinions, and those things are very important to me. And not everybody is going to agree with those opinions. Not everybody is going to agree with every single action I've taken in my life. And that's just one of the consequences of being human. And so for that reason, I feel like as an influencer, I prefer to work with brands that also that see what I've done and aren't affected by it. They might see what one person finds as detestable, the other person might find as something to celebrate. So I want to work with brands that celebrate me personally. So I think like as this evolves, it's really going to be like picking and choosing brands and influencers that are good matches for each other, because not every brand is going to be something that everybody wants. Not every brand is going to have products that everybody wants to buy in the first place. So I think it's really about, making those good matches.
Yeah, that's great. All great points. And you're so brilliant, Teddy. I could listen to you talk all day.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think everybody has a past. I think, the rise of influencers, right, over the last 10 years has been something that, a lot of people are still navigating, right? It's the same with the rise of the blog, right? We used to get our news from single sources, and now we get our news from everywhere. We used to, watch TV, and now we're looking at social. We're like on different platforms. We're multitasking with the whole world is totally different. And influencers have risen really quickly. They've become authoritative voices on a lot of topics, and they don't always have like the teams around them perhaps to coach them on how to avoid cancel culture, or how to kind of, even if you have a strong opinion about a social issue that might not be popular, like how do you bring that to light in a thoughtful way so that you're allowed to be your authentic self, but you're not so extreme that you come across as racist or sexist or anti-LGBTQ. So I think that there's some education and support that's needed. Somebody could make a TikTok video and be world famous the next day because they hit a virality threshold. And then everybody's celebrating that person. And then they go back and dig 6 months previous and find something that is totally atrocious that they've done. So I think, it's a wild world right now as we're thinking about pairing brands who are very risk adverse with influencers. We are very thoughtful about the way that we go back through and kind of vet their content, vet their story. We talk to them. We're honest about the values that we have as a brand, about where we want to go as a brand, where our hot button issues that we want to avoid as a brand are. And I've been in many situations where an influencer said, like, I don't think I'm aligned with your brand values, or I don't necessarily agree with the fact that you guys have this specific business practice or whatever that looks like. And that's okay. Like that's the best case scenario. But there have been a number of circumstances that I have been a part of where we've brought on a wonderful influencer who is extraordinarily talented, who we were totally aligned with, had a great collaborative, creative relationship, made a ton of great content together, built an audience. And then, they had a misstep, and it was a very public, very inappropriate and unacceptable misstep. And we did have to pull our contract with them and erase the content of the past. And it created a lot of aversion for that brand to ever want to work with influencers again, because the levels of investment we put into making work with them and trusting them with our brand all kind of went out the window. And so that's, I think, we look at celebrity culture, right? Celebrities have been around for a long time. They have managers, they have agents, they have teams around them that are coaching them all the time on how to show up, how to speak. Like they're trained. And, mid-level influencers or new age influencers are not always trained. So they don't know any better. And that's where it gets dicey and a little bit tricky. They don't understand sometimes, especially when they're really young, the implications of some of their actions and how that can translate to their whole livelihood going out the window in like a matter of a moment, saying one wrong word or doing one thing. So I agree, like it's hard with cancel culture. And I think it's just, how do you find people that are really values-based, that can certainly make mistakes and have a past, and that's okay. Like that, we have to be okay with that. But also understand the implications of what a significant misstep, as a, person and a human being could look like for the rest of their careers.
From the brand's perspective, if that's the case, and you go back, you hired this, they're perfectly aligned, and you find out 10 years ago they did something that is no longer aligned with the brand, and you're afraid it's going to come out. How do you properly cancel someone? And is there a crisis communication strategy that you advise to brands when that happens?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in a very severe situation where you've missed something, that might have been typically how I've discovered these things, honestly, is like people have come out against the brand for working with that person, and then they highlight the issue that we didn't find as an agency. And sometimes it's like, okay, we can deal with that. That was 10 years ago. They came out and apologized. They're like on to new and bigger, better things. Or it's something that's extremely severe where we feel like they haven't been honest and disclosed something that would have an impact on the brand. And I think, you know, it depends. Like I always think in terms of crisis, because I work with really big brands and we do crazy stuff with them all the time. And, you know, they have crazy stuff happen all the time. So I'm always thinking about what our communication strategy is, if it's good or bad. In the case that we do have to cancel a partnership with someone, I think we try to make it, you know, as seamless and empathetic and, you know, transactional as possible. Just, you know, we've decided not to continue to working with you. We don't always provide a reason. We have a very specific clause in contracts that says we can cancel our partnership at any time without any rationale or whatever that looks like. Hayley would probably have better language than that, but I'm just like, we can cancel without having to explain ourselves. But we also have to acknowledge that these are human beings and we want to, you know, we don't want to like tear them down. We don't want to make a public display out of it because it doesn't look good for us or them. But we also want to distance ourselves from what could potentially be a public issue that the brand gets wrapped up in when they have no reason to be a part of that. So I think it's just, you know, you have to look at it on a case by case basis. If it does become very public, you might have to issue a statement saying like, we were not aware, you know, all of our dealings with this person have been extraordinarily positive. There hasn't been anything negative, like kind of back them up in some ways so that, because they are, obviously they've changed and they've reformed, but also say like, you know, based on this information, we've decided to no longer partner with this person and end it there. I have been in very few situations where we've had to issue a public statement like that. However, for the most part, I've been in very few situations where we had to cancel an influencer, but in the event we did, we handled it amicably. We were pretty honest in some cases. In some cases, we just said, we're not going to keep moving forward. And that was fine. And you just kind of try to move on and let the dust settle, let those like 5 consumers that have pointed out the issue, like go on their merry way and, you know, move on and keep making great content and keep working with great people to tell your story.
Yeah, and I want to move on, but I have one more question for you on this subject. So how do you know when a situation calls for a public response and when it doesn't?
I think it's typically if it makes mainstream media. So
Gotcha.
Let's say like, you know, all of a sudden you wake up in the morning to the headline on Adweek being X brand works with racist family, right? Like that's when you have to, and we're typically prepared with that stuff so we can respond immediately. And typically an Adweek would probably reach out to us in advance to say, hey, we got word of this, we're writing a story, would you like to comment? And then in that moment, we would have the opportunity to issue a statement and do an interview. And you can't make the media not publish a story once they've decided they're going to move forward with it because they think it will get enough eyeballs. So in that case, you just have to be prepared preemptively.
Right. And you know, we also have the issue of changing times. I believe, and this might be a little bit out of my age range, but Ellen DeGeneres was canceled when she came out, pretty much, right? Like there was a whole like movement around that, and now she's one of the biggest brands out there. And so I wonder, you know, when you're making decisions based on cultural trends or acceptance or movements. I know, Teddy, you brought up something on our call, which is the tokenization of minority groups. Are there ways for brands to not, you know, exploit, but, you know, include and have diverse advertising in a more authentic way? From your perspective, I'd really love to hear.
Yeah. I, as a trans woman, I'm oftentimes included in many, many pride campaigns, which I always find to be really funny because it's like, it seems like that LGBTQ acceptance and LGBTQ inclusivity is relegated to 1 month out of the year. So everybody comes out with a pride campaign, which I always find to be kind of frustrating because people aren't just gay for the month of June. So I find that to be just sort of silly. I think that a way to avoid tokenization is to avoid these pride campaigns in general, and to just have inclusive marketing strategies regardless of the month, 24/7, 365 days a year. And I feel like to a consumer that feels so much more authentic anyways. I think a lot of times brands have a lot of issues with seeming totally inauthentic. And this is a conversation that comes up around Pride every single year when all these Pride campaigns come out. Like, is this for real? Like, how serious really, how serious is this brand really about caring about LGBTQ issues? Or is this just to save face? And I think that the wisest decision is just, if you have a brand practice, if you have a code of morals, that's something you should be exhibiting throughout the entire course of your advertising. June, May, July, August, like October, December. Inclusivity shouldn't be relegated to just Black History Month, just Pride Month, just women's, International Women's Day. I think that a lot of brands have that misstep. And I think that it would be wise for them to, catch on to the fact that consumers feel like they're being infantilized when you tokenize influencers, because a lot of times the reason why influencers become so popular is because they're not only are they just admirable figures, they're also people that other people identify with. So a lot of times a customer might see a little piece of themselves in an influencer, and when they feel like an influencer has been wronged, it almost feels like a personal attack on them. So I think that that's like that's an important thing for brands to be aware of.
Yeah, absolutely. And who are some brands that you think are doing it well? I mean, do you have any at the top of your head where you're like, yeah, that brand's got it down?
I really,
you don't have to answer. Yeah.
I honestly, like, I wish I could give you an answer, but I feel like a lot of brands suck. So I mean, I like it. I think that this is I genuinely cannot name a single, off the top of my head, name a single brand who, practices that 365 days a year. I mean, however, the one thing I will say, I mean, I'm sort of more like fashion oriented. That's like more my area of expertise. 10 years ago, you'd be hard pressed to find more than one person of color in a fashion show, or one person of color in a campaign in general. Now it's standard practice for there to be a diverse cast of models, a diverse cast of influencers and fashion advertising all year round. And I think that's only because consumers have said, excuse me, why is there only Black models during the Black History Month makeup collection, but then in October you don't have a single person of color in your advertising? It's not like people are just Black for that one month, or people are gay for just that one month, as I said before. So I think that really, like, the good thing about the internet is that now the consumer, the customer, has a voice to let the brand know how they're feeling about their advertising or their products. And so I think that the only reason why we've seen this sort of change and push towards diversity isn't because brands have gotten like nicer and better and more inclusive. It's because they've been forced to by the people who are consuming their products.
Right. And some of those people are their employees that are coming up with these campaigns too, right? So we see that internal shift happening.
Yeah.
And do you feel as though with working with influencers, the need for diversity, all year round for that authentic approach is why we're seeing like micro influencers sort of becoming more and more popular, where you have, maybe you're working with 1,000 influencers for the same budget that you'd be working with a single one. I know, Jess, you work with a lot of influencers. What's the split between, the big heavy hitters and then the micro influencer campaigns?
Yeah, I think brands are trying to diversify. I mean, when you have a really big budget, you can work with a few macro influencers and you're always thinking about casting for diversity. But I've seen, a big budget come in and we say like, this can support 1 macro influencer or 10 micro influencers, or maybe like 4 micro and like 4 mid-level. And I think the inclination for every brand is unless we lock 1 macro influencer that's like totally diverse and like brings kind of a great point of view, like then we would rather have more who have more diversity. So I am seeing definitely a shift away from the macro because of budgets, because if a client has $100,000 or $500,000 to spend, they would rather have a diverse set of voices kind of out there telling their story that then they can amplify with paid media and make it just as big as if they were working with 1 macro influencer, reaching that same level of scale.
Great. And just to be fair across the board, I think Teddy, you also touched on, you used an example of Chanel, for instance, but the brands have reputations and histories as well. And they're using influencers to shift their perception quite drastically. So what are some ways, if a brand does go through a crisis, they release a commercial that's not perceived well, we saw this, I think it was Gillette or whatnot, to go after a campaign in an authentic way that doesn't, that helps them sort of shift that perception or tell their story in a new way so that they don't get caught up in the past bad press or negative connotation with the brand.
So I think we've seen the rise of purpose, right? Purpose-driven marketing, and that's been happening for probably 15 years, but it's a lot more prevalent, I would say, in the last 5. And I think every brand is looking for like, what is their purpose in the world? What's their give back? Because honestly, like young millennials and older Gen Z who are coming into the workforce are not going to want to work with a brand that's not aligned with their values. And every brand realizes that. So in some ways, as much as it's a critical external play and the right thing to do as a brand, it's also an employee retention strategy, attraction and retention strategy. So I think every brand is now kind of has some sort of foundational purpose, their guide for what they're going to stand for in the world, what good they're going to do in the world, in addition to profit. So I think Pepsi said it best, and this was like the first purpose-driven brand that I'd been exposed to, and this was probably in like 2006 or 7, but they said it's purpose with profit, right? So it's not profit first, it's purpose, but it comes along with profit. And so as you define what your purpose is in the world, it also still has a connection to your bottom line. Like they're selling cans of sugary water in the world, but like how big can their purpose be? Well, then they create like a massive recycling program and a reusable bottle program, and they try to reduce their carbon emissions and have a stronger point of view on sustainability. So then they work with a group of influencers who are diverse in nature, but also have a slant towards sustainability, who can help them tell their story. I think that's a really good example of like how they do that. But honestly, it's not on the onus of the influencer to like drive the purpose of the brand. They're just facilitating the story like any other media vehicle would.
And what about employees? How, if we're talking micro influencers, are employees seen as micro influencers? And Hayley, maybe you could speak to this a little bit. Are there legal implications that come with that? If your employees are sharing your content or asked to share the content, do they then fall under a category of influencer?
So I can talk quickly, and then I'd like Hayley to obviously hit the legal piece. But I know in the US specifically, like brands are constrained, like they're not allowed to ask their employees to share content on their behalf. It's actually an illegal practice. So they have other ways of doing it, right? They post stuff to like their intranet and say like, look at our new campaign. It's so great. Feel free to share, but like the language is loose. But we did run into a situation with a brand where they like blasted their 3,000 employees and said, please post this to socials so we can get like more impact, or please vote on this, or what. Like it was very directive that employees needed to do something. And they actually got reported and had like a lawsuit on their hands. So that's been an interesting one. I don't really think of employees as micro influencers as much, but I would think of them as advocates, right? And that's a different kind of play that's unpaid. It's like because they believe and love the company that they work for so much, on their own accord, go out and talk about it. And that's advocacy. That's not influence.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with that. And I think the key distinction is what you just mentioned, Jess, which is the kind of paid for element obviously an employee is paid, but they are paid to do their job. And actually, if you look at where the regulators get involved from a marketing perspective with influencers, it's where there is payment going to an individual. So, and you know, that's the kind of distinction. And if I look at the regulators and what it's not employees that they're looking at, and that's partly because it wouldn't really fall in the way that the current regulation is set up. And most companies wouldn't have their employees acting in the same way that you would a micro influencer. And you know, big organizations will have social media policies and sort of from both sides, because also rules against what they want their employees to be doing, because you do get cases of kind of, you know, the rogue employee who's out there putting all their opinions on social media, and that's a whole different topic, you know, how that then impacts on the employer. But I think it is seen differently from a regulatory perspective. I think the topic of micro influencers is interesting from a regulator perspective as well, because actually if you look at the UK, in the UK, if someone has 30,000 followers, they are classed as a celebrity under the ASA rules, and actually that's quite low. I don't have anything like 30,000 followers, but you know, a lot of people do, right? And actually when that came out, people thought actually that's quite low, and that does really bring in, you know, the micro influencer kind of scope into being a class as celebrity, which in the UK and in other jurisdictions will, so you can't promote certain product ranges, etc. So I think it is interesting because the regulators are definitely interested in the micro influencer space. I think to your question around employees, and that's a different kind of category. But yeah, it's certainly not the view that someone with not very many followers wouldn't be kind of caught within regulation.
So brands loose language around, you know, you share if you want to, but it's the mandatory is completely illegal, which is good to know. And let's talk for a second. We talked a little bit about how brands vet influencers. How do influencers vet brands? So Teddy, what do you, if you're going to work with a brand, are there things that you look for, or you're like, no, I'm not going to help you fix your reputation, or I'm not going to, you know, where you can kind of identify that it's not an authentic approach?
Yeah, well, at the same time, when I work with brands, I also have to take into account that I am my own personal brand as an influencer. So for me, associating with brands has to be something that I think won't be damaging to myself or to my message. So I definitely take into account every brand that I work with to make sure that, first of all, it's something that I, you know, a brand that I think is good, but also a brand that I think complements me well and brings me positive attention and positive press, and that by me associating with them, it wouldn't cause any problems. For me, for example, like if Chick-fil-A reached out to me to rehabilitate their LGBTQ like image, considering they have like a horrific track record with that sort of thing, I would say no to that project, because it seem incredibly inauthentic for me as a trans woman who has come out against transphobia and anti-gay propaganda, essentially, to work with a brand who's very openly said that this is where we stand on those issues. So yeah, I definitely think inauthenticity or authenticity in general has a big component in the way that I vet brands that I would like to work with. But also, you know, somebody like Jess is a great resource for this sort of thing, because I have an agent, for example. Like I have somebody who works on my behalf to make sure that like whatever offers are coming through somebody who sort of knows what I stand for and what I represent, and is only presenting me with opportunities that you know, I would agree to. I think that, you know, you have to be really careful. Another thing I took a stand on was sexual assault, which is like rampant in the fashion industry. So I took a hardline stance after the Me Too movement that I wouldn't work with any brand that had a history of collaborating with people who have been accused of multiple sexual assault allegations. And so until those people were vetted out. So for me personally, as an influencer, I'm not just looking at the brand in general. I'm also looking at like anybody who could, any representative of the brands, like the CEO, the stylist, the casting director, the whatever, like all of those people who are also associated with the brand also are important to take into consideration when collaborating as well. So I definitely try to do that. But that's just me personally. There are a lot of influencers who just want money and are willing to sell their soul for a quick buck. I think that just depends on the influencer and where they stand on those issues.
That affiliation piece as an influencer with your own brand is so important as well, especially if you're doing the same campaign. How often are you disclosing who else is part of a campaign? If you're reaching out to an influencer and you're like, hey, we're running this campaign, do you include the other names, or how often do you ask? Never.
On the brand side, we don't ever really share. And it's pretty rare that people even ask the question. So, you know, there could be like collaborative executions, right? Where we have like some sort of, let's just say, for example, we were doing a deal with the Olympics and we had 15 influencers and they were passing the torch to each other. Like we would obviously say we have 15 athletes lined up who are going to participate in this, and we want you to be a part of it. You're going to collect your torch from Carl Lewis and pass it over to Serena Williams, like just to give them a concept of it. But it's not very traditional that we would disclose the other people working on a campaign, largely because none of that content is uniform, because every influencer has a different style and flavor and delivery. And we always want to empower influencers to tell their story through their voice, because that's what brings their audience in. If it's really inauthentic, it's going to feel like a commercial. Influencers don't want that. Their audience don't want that. And ultimately, it's not going to yield any results for a brand. So I don't think it's necessary to disclose, but I really haven't been in a situation where an influencer actually demanded to know who else was a part of it. And I think if I was, I don't think it would be an issue to share that at all.
I just want to hop in as an influencer myself. I always personally, I always ask for who else is going to be in the campaign alongside me. And typically there's not an issue with the brand disclosing like a few people that are going to be in the campaign as well. But also it's important for me, like, I don't want to stand next to somebody in a makeup campaign, for example, that I totally disagree with politically or disagree with morally on issues, because then that inauthenticates the message that I'm trying to put out, and that inauthenticates my brand image. So, I mean, I think that like from an influencer side, I think it's wise for influencers to ask those questions of brands, because, and I think that I would hope that, you know, brands are willing and open to share that information. And in my experience, they have been.
Yeah, I think that, I think a lot of influencers don't ask because they're doing their own thing, right? They're going to go off and make their own content that's going to go on their own channels. But Teddy, I totally agree. If you're like getting cast to be a part of let's just call it like a commercial for like a makeup brand, and they say, we're going to have 5 women and we want you to be like one of the spokespeople, then obviously you're going to want to know, like, if I'm in this contained unit with other people, who are those people? I just think the difference is in this case, like typically, you know, influencers are off like running and doing their own thing. They're not even like affiliated, but they will have the same type of hashtags and people can connect those dots. So I agree. I think if I was an influencer, I would totally ask, but as a brand, we don't proactively share that.
So we have just 5 minutes left, and I would love to hear from each of you some of the trends that haven't been discussed here today that you've seen, or, you know, whether it's influencer brands should be made aware of, or something that you think is becoming popular, and maybe like the next thing, whether it's a platform or a campaign type or an influencer campaign structure. Maybe Jess, will start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we're seeing a lot of technology crop up to make kind of what we're calling like the middle band of influencers very big and power their content. And I see a very big trend of people running wild in this space and gaining very quick popularity without necessarily knowing the implications of what cancel culture is. And so I'm eager and very nervous to watch how the next year plays out now that technology is so readily available to help people broadcast themselves in such a big way and to build followings, how monetization is actually going to work using that technology. Like we're seeing influencers say what should I wear, my red hat or my blue hat? And people are voting on it. And then they're like, should I go knock my brother down? So first person to pay me $5, I'll do it. It's crazy. They're documenting every phase of their life and people are making decisions for them and paying them to make certain decisions. And, I'm very curious, how this plays out. And then I think it will reach a point of it's just too much content. And then what happens and how do we start to weed through that again? I think the rise of Clubhouse, for example, is very interesting to me right now because that's traditional radio. I haven't listened to traditional radio in years. I'd listen to Sirius radio when I'm in my car, but that's about it. But I'm thinking Twitter and radio had a baby and now it's Clubhouse and people are really engaged on that platform and maybe they're just videoed out. And so what's going to be the trend there in terms of how influencers come onto an app like that and broadcast their voices and their opinions. And I think it's going to give rise to a little bit more of the thought leadership experts and people with, like Teddy, who have these amazing podcasts and these great stories to share. And it's going to be a little bit more, I think, educational and academic, which I'm looking forward to.
Especially you see every platform copying each other. So now they all offer the same thing, which is Twitter just had a baby that was Clubhouse now, which is crazy.
Yeah.
We'll start with Hayley.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've talked about kind of regulation and where that's going. I think there will be increased scrutiny in the paid for marketing space by regulators. And we're very much seeing in the UK, probably more even than the rest of the EU, or the EU as it is now, not the rest of. But we are seeing the regulators really, really active there, and a lot more of a kind of consumer protectionist approach, even more so I think that's been taken in the US. So I think that's an interesting space in terms of the regulation. The other thing I think is quite interesting, and it'll be just quite exciting to watch where this goes, is the unionization at the influencer level. And in the UK we have the Creators Union, and obviously in the US you guys have the American Influencer Council, and sort of where that, I think, and that's all obviously pushing for increased transparency from an influencer perspective, and that sort of married with the regulation side, I think is a bit of a hot area and something that we'll see evolve through this year.
Teddy, we'll wrap up with you.
Yeah, I think personally in the future, we are going to see the rise of the unsafe, un-PC influencer. I think that Rush Limbaugh has had tons of sponsors on his show before he died. I mean, there's always been a market for people who have sort of unsavory popular opinions, garnishing advertiser money. And I think that that's only going to become more popular, just because I think that people are getting tired of the kind of PC culture that we're that's being pushed down our throats all the time. And I think that there are obviously going to be some brands that play it safe. However, I think that there is going to be a big push towards brands working with people who have, done things that, some people detest, that some people don't agree with. And I think that that's going to be okay. I think that people in the future are going to be able to separate those two things, separate the influencer from the brand and the brand from the influencer, and be more open to the idea of working with somebody who has a less politically correct agenda.
Yeah, so key takeaways for me here today are that people are getting smarter and more interested in topics over influencers. And we're seeing that with the trend in technology. And as you said, the trend in following people who maybe have unsavory opinions, and regulators are also getting smarter. So we should be paying attention to all three of those things, especially as a brand. Well, thank you, ladies, so much for this conversation. We're going to wrap up and let you go about your day. But if if anyone wants to reach them, please reach out to GetGlobal, and I'm sure Julian will help make those connections. But thank you again for being here.
Thanks for moderating, Cynthia. Bye, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.